The conflict in Ukraine has exacerbated the global refugee crisis and exposed its deep inequalities. With the UN warning that over 8.5 million Ukrainians will become refugees this year, twice its initial estimate, can European countries cope? And how will it affect the tens of millions of refugees who have fled other wars and conflicts? Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. As the US and other Western countries rush billions of dollars to Ukraine in military and humanitarian aid, as the country continues to push back Russia's offensive, which has already displaced millions, the United Nations estimates that more than 11 million Ukrainians have fled their homes since the conflict began. 5.3 million have left for neighboring countries, while another 6.5 million have been internally displaced. The war in Ukraine has contributed to an unprecedented global refugee crisis, with the UN estimating that more than 82 million people have been forcibly displaced worldwide. The crisis is also laying bare the stark difference in the way different groups of refugees are being treated. Earlier this week, it was reported that Afghan refugees in Germany were being evicted to make way for recently arrived Ukrainian refugees. We traveled to Calais in northern France, where Ukrainian refugees began to arrive in March, and where refugees who have fled other conflicts have long been camped out in the open, waiting to cross the English Channel.
الغاب الحياة صعبة جدا، برد وامطار، ومرات يكون عندك حاجة تغطى بها ومرات يكون ما في. انت حظك ممكن تخلي حاجاتك مربطة في أكياس، خدتها في أكياس على جنب، تيجي البوليس يلقاك ما في ياخدهم ويمشي، تصبح ما عندك أي حاجة تغطى بها، ما عندك حاجة تسكن فيها.
Calais, comme d'autres villes en France, se mobilisent pour l'accueil des réfugiés ukrainiens. Ont été extrêmement choqués par la différence de traitement entre ces réfugiés et d'autres réfugiés qui sont quelquefois à Calais depuis des mois, voire un petit peu plus, et qui viennent également de pays en guerre comme la Syrie, comme le sud du Soudan, comme le Tigré également en Éthiopie. Ces personnes-là ne sont pas hébergées et la politique du gouvernement français consiste à les décourager de venir à Calais et les encourager à partir.
بشرتنا ما بيضاء والعيون ما زرق، على حسب ما هم صرحوا احنا شفنا في الميديا يعني وشايفينه في التلفزيون انهم هم مربيين ومتعلمين وبيعرفوا الانستغرام وبيعرفوا يتواصلوا مع الميديا وبيعرفوا النت والحاجات دي. على حسب قولهم نحن أفارقة جايين من أفريقيا، يعني ما عندنا خلفية عن التعليم ولا يعني ناس جاهلين.
And while so many refugees continue to live in these difficult conditions, how will Europe cope with the mass influx of refugees from Ukraine? And where does it leave other refugees, those who have fled wars and conflicts in Africa, the Middle East, and Afghanistan? Joining me now from the Cherkasy region in central Ukraine is Violeta Shemet, Communication Coordinator for the Norwegian Refugee Council, one of the organizations working to provide emergency aid and shelter to the millions of people who've been forced to flee their homes. Violeta Shemet, we just saw how the Ukraine refugee crisis, which is a massive, rapid exodus of people, probably the fastest in recent history with over 5 million refugees in just 2 months, is creating deep inequalities in the way refugees from different parts of the world are being treated. From your vantage point, though, in central Ukraine, what is your assessment of the humanitarian refugee crisis?
Thanks for the question. This is indeed the most massive displacement since the World War II, and now it's over 13 million people are forcibly displaced within Ukraine and neighboring countries. So actually, we are talking about over 5 million people who crossed the Ukrainian border and entered other countries, the nearest ones and others in Europe. And also, we have now over 7 million people displaced within Ukraine. And actually here in central Ukraine, I observed the situation when people just use these regions as transit points for people who want to travel abroad or who want to be relocated to the western part of Ukraine, where the area is like relatively safe, not complete, but safer than in northern part or southern or even eastern part of Ukraine.
1 in 4 Ukrainians have already been forced to flee their homes. What is your organization's working scenario? Can you and other humanitarian organizations, can European countries cope with a greater number of refugees, because it is now already over 10% of Ukraine's population that's been displaced?
The Norwegian Refugee Council is scaling up its program within Ukraine and in neighboring countries. And we implement our programs here in Ukraine and in Poland and Romania as well through local partners. We provide life-saving assistance to all refugees, such as food, cash, shelter, and even legal assistance to people who lost their documentations or need any types of counseling in terms of how to obtain some statuses or how to receive additional civil or other documentation or to establish their ownership rights for the property or even receive compensation for the destroyed or damaged housing.
And there's no doubt that the support that Ukrainian refugees have been getting highlights the far from adequate response that other refugees have been getting, the forgotten refugees, the ones we just saw in our report from Calais, and so many others like them. How do you compare and contrast the aid the different sets of refugees in Europe are getting?
As you can see from our reports and from the interviews of our Secretary General, he calls not to forget about the other refugee crisis and forgotten crisis in many countries in Central Africa, for example, or in Asia. He says that as far as Ukrainian crisis is in the headlines of all the news and topics, we should not forget about other crises lasting for 8 and even 10 years. And actually, we as Norwegian Refugee Council call all the humanitarian community, all their decision makers to pay attention to other crises and the links and other issues that Ukrainian crisis can create and link to deterioration of crises in Africa and Asia, such as, for example, famine or lacking of food and broken supply chains and so on.
According to UNHCR, Syria does remain the world's biggest refugee crisis, with 6.8 million people having fled the conflict there. Have these refugees and many like them largely been forgotten as a result of the crisis in Ukraine? Because you have operations, I know, in about 35 countries worldwide. Is the conflict in Ukraine, though, taking away not only resources, but also political attention from these other crises? Afghanistan, for example, has completely been forgotten in the West, and yet the plight of Afghans has worsened over the past few months.
We, as the Norwegian Refugee Council, do our best to highlight all the crises that last for many years, and we try to provide information about the needs and the situation in other countries, along with information about Ukraine. And also we issue reports about neglected crises, where we put data and information for our donors and the international community about the suffering of people there, about the necessity to provide additional funding, and not forget about those people, and not to concentrate the attention on only this one problem that we observe now in the world, but also to look at other people not far from Ukraine. And we know that they are not from far for us, and we know about their suffering, but still we call all the humanitarian, first of all, community and donors to divide their funding equally and with regard to the needs observed and assessed in other countries and in Ukraine as well.
And it isn't a new problem. Already back in the 1990s, in fact, during the wars of the former Yugoslavia, the treatment of European refugees from Yugoslavia stood in sharp contrast to those from other countries and crises. Back then, the UN Secretary General said so, and he criticized the West. It's even more obvious today, I suppose. What are the criteria that you use in allocating resources?
The Norwegian Refugee Council treats all the refugees and displaced people, affected people, people in need equally, regardless of their nationality, of their religion, and so on. So for us, there is no difference between people. We try to support everybody according to their needs, and we try to do as much as possible. We try to do more to bring relief to them and to their families.
Violetta Schemet, Communication Director of the Norwegian Refugee Council, thank you very much for joining me. The global refugee crisis has been steadily worsening over the last decade as new conflicts are added to the long list of unresolved military and humanitarian crises. According to UNHCR, there are more than 82.4 million people forcibly displaced worldwide. 86% of those are hosted in developing countries. More than 70% of those displaced are from 5 countries: Syria, Sudan, Afghanistan, Venezuela, and now Ukraine. In 2020, only 34,000 refugees were resettled. More than 40% of those displaced worldwide are children. And so with low and middle income countries continuing to host the largest worldwide share of refugees, 9 in 10, they also face mounting social and economic pressures. Meanwhile, some of the world's wealthiest nations, including the United States, take in a very limited number of refugees every year. Since 1975, the US has accepted a total of 3.5 million refugees, according to data from the State Department. The number of refugees arriving in the US peaked in 1980, when President Jimmy Carter signed the US Refugee Act. Since then, US admissions have reached record lows. While the Biden administration has said it would receive up to 125,000 refugees in fiscal year 2022, it has taken in fewer than 9,000 in the first 6 months. My next guest, Deborah Ross, is a U.S. Congresswoman from North Carolina who sponsored several pieces of legislation in support of refugee resettlement in the U.S. Congresswoman Ross, I know you're in the middle of discussions in the U.S. Congress relating to the situation in Ukraine and how to help. And I know you've been one of the most vocal and active members of the U.S. Congress when it comes to providing assistance to refugees, Afghan refugees, Ukrainian refugees, and others. You sponsored legislation that would help in the resettlement of those refugees here in the U.S. Now, with almost 2/3 of Ukrainian children forced to flee their homes, you've asked the Biden administration to issue expedited visas for Ukrainian children who are being adopted here in the U.S. by U.S. families. Will the refugee crisis in Ukraine change the political dynamics that have too often led to a sluggish resettlement process here in the U.S.?
Well, thank you very, very much for inviting me to be with you. And I am hoping that the refugee crisis from Ukraine will help accelerate how the United States deals with refugees from all over the world. We have seen an outpouring of support for Afghan refugees. In my office, we have personally worked with Afghan refugees in the resettlement process, and we've worked with churches and NGOs about this. On the Ukrainian front, I, of course, am working hand in hand with the Biden administration and NGOs and churches and other groups to help with Ukrainian refugees. The very specific thing that I asked for children, orphans who are being adopted from Ukraine, is that for those orphans that already have most of their paperwork done, because of the situation, just the logistical situation in Ukraine, to expedite their paperwork. So meaning that if they move around to a different country because they can't be somewhere safely, that we can make sure that there aren't paperwork snags. So that if the parent who wants to adopt them cannot go to Ukraine, that maybe they could do that in a neighboring country.
Sure,
And
Congresswoman,
already
but let me
we're
just
seeing-
ask you this,
yes.
though, Congresswoman, because there's no doubt everyone would agree that the US and other countries who can help should do all they can in the resettlement of Ukrainian refugees. But with the US becoming so involved in the Russia-Ukraine conflict by sending weapons and other military aid to Ukraine, which many would argue is creating a more protracted conflict, forcing more people to become refugees, do you believe the US has an added responsibility to take in more refugees and do more to help stop the fighting?
Well, the first thing I would say is that it is so important that we aid the Ukrainians militarily, because the alternative would be for Ukraine to become part of the Russian state and suffer even more. And we went through that. And we went through World War II, and we have a responsibility to democracy and to our allies in NATO to make sure that the Ukrainians are successful and they are fighting a valiant fight. I do agree with you that we have a responsibility to refugees from around the world. We are a nation of immigrants, and many people came here as refugees. We have passed in the House of Representatives a bill to extend temporary protected status to refugees.
But do you agree that all refugees aren't treated equally, that the Biden administration, as you say, plans to issue visas for 100,000 Ukrainian refugees who would be allowed to enter and stay here in the United States for up to 2 years on what is called humanitarian parole? That is the same system that was used for Afghans, the over 70,000 Afghans who came here. But is that where the similarities between these two groups of refugees begin and end?
So what I would say is we need comprehensive immigration reform and refugee reform in this country. There is no question. I have been a strong proponent of that, not just on a case-by-case basis, but writ large. Right now, as we're speaking, and I know some of this will air later, we are dealing with the Secretary of Homeland Security, who wants nothing more than to have a comprehensive refugee and immigration policy. This will create stability both in this country and have us be leaders in dealing with humanitarian crises. And it should not be in a case-by-case basis. The Ukraine situation right now and the Afghan situation have reached crisis points, and we have addressed them immediately. But there is a backlog of problems.
There's a backlog of problems, as you say, and there's also a huge difference in popular opinion. A recent Gallup poll showed that 78% of Americans are in favor of helping the 100,000 Ukrainian refugees who would be coming into the United States. Of course, the US needs to help refugees in Ukraine. Is it, though, doing enough when it comes to helping Afghan refugees? Does the Biden administration have far more responsibility to help them more than 250,000 Afghans, estimated to have worked directly with the US military and to have helped US officials in Afghanistan?
There's no question that we do. It is our responsibility. And as I said, My office is doing everything that it can to help Afghan refugees that come to North Carolina and to get people out of Afghanistan. We have done a tremendous amount in our one little congressional office. The Biden administration and the Congress owes it to the Afghan people to make sure that they are treated with dignity and respect and kept safe, as we do with the Ukrainians, as we do with Haitian refugees who are currently in our country because they cannot return to Haiti. This is a much bigger question. It is up to Congress to deal with this.
The US did not use its refugee system to resettle the more than 70,000 Afghans who were allowed to come into the US. Do you believe that Afghans who fled the country following the US pullout and who became target of reprisals should be considered refugees and should have been allowed to come into the US on that basis?
I absolutely believe that they should be able to go through the refugee process and be given the right to be able to come in as refugees. The problem is our system. Our system does not allow for the quick processing of refugees, and we need to fix the broken system. I also think that blaming this entirely on the Biden administration is incorrect. The Trump administration broke our immigration system almost beyond repair. The Biden administration is doing what it can to improve the system, to be fair to all refugees, and to prod Congress to deal with the overall issue of immigration in the United States. We always need to do more. I am committed to doing more, and Congress is committed to doing more. But we have to recognize where the problem started and then understand that it will take time to make it right.
But Congresswoman, is it really fair to blame it all on the Trump administration or other previous Republican administrations who have not historically taken in a big number of refugees? Because a lot of these refugees are coming here on this so-called humanitarian parole system. They have no path to permanent residency. You can only stay here for up to 2 years. So beyond that, their legal status is on very shaky grounds.
Right. So it is fair to lay it on two things. One, the Trump administration, which made it much more difficult. And second, a divided Congress. So we have had problems reforming our immigration system because either one house of Congress would be in favor of it or another one. In the past, the Senate was able to do it. Right now, the House is able to do it. I am working on it, and the House has already passed legislation helping people with temporary protected status. The problem right now is that we have a Senate that is unwilling to do that, and it is an election year. And as your viewers likely know, immigration has become a very hot button issue in our elections. That's just a fact. But it does not mean that we stop our efforts. It does not mean that we stop caring and that we stop trying. And that is what I am doing every day. And that is what so many of my colleagues are doing. And what we need to do is make sure that we make that case to the American people in a way that unites us, holds us up, and does not divide us.
You just mentioned how divisive the issue of immigration is here in the US. It's a hot button issue, certainly ahead of the midterm elections in the fall. There's also this clash among Democrats and Republicans about what is going on at the border, at the US-Mexico border.
As I've said, the US refugee system needs to be reformed. The most effective way to do that is in a bipartisan way that shows compassion and understanding for people from all over the world and recognizes that the United States is a nation of immigrants and has been a haven for refugees who go on to do extraordinary things in this country. And You have my commitment that I will work on this issue, and I believe that there are many people of good faith, not just in Congress, but throughout our country who care about this issue, in NGOs, in our religious institutions, and in our community. The outpouring of support has been extraordinary.
All right, Congresswoman Ross, thank you for all the efforts you make, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
It is my pleasure. Thank you.
With millions and millions of refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Myanmar, and so many other war-torn countries and territories still living in precarious conditions, sometimes for generations, in refugee camps and in a state of limbo, the open-arm policy of many European and other Western countries towards Ukrainian refugees, while highly commendable, stands in sharp contrast to attitudes and policies towards other groups of refugees, especially those from the South. That contrast was plain to see in the treatment that Black and brown refugees from Ukraine experienced. And with obvious electoral risks in supporting higher numbers of refugees, even refugees from Ukraine, the policy of some of the world's wealthiest countries, like the US, which immigrants and refugees helped to build, isn't likely to change anytime soon. That's all from me, Rida Fakhri, and the team. Thanks for watching. See you next time.